Well, good morning, guys. Welcome back. It is the first Sunday of December. That's crazy. We're like, Christmas is literally right around the corner. Well, this is wishing you and your family a Merry Christmas, a happy Advent season. I know at River's Edge, it's an exciting time for us. We get the opportunity, we do the Advent wreath, and so we take some time at the beginning of every service and just really reflect on what Advent is, the coming of Christ, joy, peace, all of the things that he represents that the world truly did not have prior to Jesus coming. And so we're excited to share this season with you. We will be finishing up the book of 2 Corinthians this month. That's crazy to me, but man, it seems like we've been in 1 and 2 Corinthians for a really long time, and we have. But we are coming to the end of it. We're going to finish, we won't finish chapter 11 today, but we'll come really close to finishing it. And then we have chapter 12 and chapter 13. And chapter 13 really is just a quick passage on examining yourself, and then some greetings at the end. And then we'll be done, and we'll figure out where we go from there. But we're going to pick up in verse 5 today. We left off with verse 4 last time. And just to give you a little bit of the backstory, the last time we were together, we were talking about the Apostle Paul, and he was talking about how he was jealous for the Corinthian Christians. Again, they were the false teachers, the stir-uppers were questioning Paul's apostleship, his right to speak into the lives of the Corinthians. And so he's defending his apostleship. He says, I'm jealous for you with a godly jealousy. And in other words, not that he was jealous of them, he was jealous for them, their spiritual well-being, their spiritual growth, their protection, their holiness, their purity, their righteousness, all of those things. The things that the false teacher were destroying, Paul was trying to build up. And then he says, as an example, I've betrothed you to one husband, which is Christ Jesus. And Paul likened himself to the friend of the bridegroom who ensured the purity and the safety and the well-being and the provision of the bride until the bridegroom returns to collect her and take him back into the Father's house. And we talked a little bit about how, obviously, speaking of Jesus, and Paul is saying, just like Jesus is the bridegroom, I'm the friend of the bride, and I'm doing what is best for you while you wait for him to return until you meet him again. And then he briefly references Eve and says, just like Eve fell for the trickery of the serpent, you're falling for the same trickery, this idea that God isn't enough, that our intentions are not well intended towards you. And then he ends up, and he finishes the first section was saying that the problem with the Corinthian Christians was not necessarily that there were false teachers in the church, because that is a big issue, and it is the issue of the false teachers. But the problem with the Corinthian Christians, they were putting up with it. They were allowing them in. They were allowing them to have influence. And Paul is saying, man, get rid of these guys. Don't let them control the church. And so then we pick up in verses 5 through 9. And this is, another thing that the false teachers were doing. And what they were criticizing Paul for was his humility. As we've talked before, Paul was not an attractive man. He was short, probably 5 foot 1 or 2 at the most. He was stooped over. He was bald-headed. He had a unibrow that went all the way across. He had a broken nose. His legs were crooked and bow-legged, probably from malnutrition as well as abuse. Remember, he was stoned and left for dead a number of times. He suffered greatly for the kingdom. And if you can imagine having rocks thrown at your head, being stoned, drug out of the city and left for dead, you would not be a very attractive person. And so they were looking at the outward appearance of Paul, and they were saying, how can you be an apostle? You're not handsome, you don't speak well, you're not eloquent, you're not wealthy, you don't dress nice. There's nothing about you that would endear us to you in the physical sense. And so Paul is going to talk about that here in verses 5 through 9. And this is what he says. For I consider myself not in the least inferior to the most eminent apostles. Paul's being sarcastic here. He's talking about the false teachers and the imminency of their apostleship as they declared of themselves. But even if I am unskilled in speech, yet am not so in knowledge. In fact, in every way we have made this evident to you in all things. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself that you might be exalted? Because I preached the gospel of God to you without charge. Just for context, in Paul's day, money was made through oration. Men who could speak well, who were eloquent, who could make good arguments, who could debate well, were highly honored and highly favored in the Corinthian culture and in the Greek culture of the entire day around that whole part of the world. And so they would often have these public debates, and whoever won the debate would receive payment for it. Oftentimes, when wealthy people had parties, they would hire eloquent speakers to come in to speak, to recite poetry, and they were paid money for that. And Paul is saying, I haven't charged you any money. And so you're saying because I've not charged you and you've not had to pay me, I'm not worthy of what's being said? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Verse 8, I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to serve you. And when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supplied my need. And in everything I kept myself from being a burden to you and will continue to do so. Paul says, for I consider that I am not at all inferior to the eminent apostles. Paul here compares himself to some he refers to as the most eminent apostles. Apparently, these were apostles that the Corinthian Christians preferred over Paul. There is some warm-hearted debate in Christian circles, commentators, people who study this, that they think that the prominent apostles were people such as Peter or Apollos because they're mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1 verse 12 that, some prefer Apollos and some this and some that. I remember that whole argument that Paul makes. But this isn't likely, and here's why. It's probably because Paul is talking sarcastically of the false apostles who claim to be superior to Paul. And so you had these false apostles in the church. They were claiming to be superior to Paul. And so Paul is sarcastically saying those prominent apostles, those eminent apostles who present themselves to you. In the original language, the idea behind the phrase, the most eminent apostles, is extra super apostles. You can almost just hear that ring of sarcasm. Paul probably writes sarcastically in reference to those who thought of and promoted themselves as super duper apostles. He says, I am not at all inferior. Whoever these most eminent apostles are, Paul will not claim to be less than they. Paul will explain how he, and in an unlikely way, is greater than these supposedly most eminent apostles. I am not inferior. Whoever they were, Paul was making it very clear that although he acted in humility, although he set himself aside, although he didn't charge them for his services, that did not make him less than them just because he wasn't a great orator, because he wasn't skilled in speech, didn't distract or take away from the message that he was presenting. He says, even though I am unskilled in speech, Paul's, according to the standards of Greek rhetoric, was very unskilled in speech. In Paul's day, the ability to speak in a polished, sophisticated, entertaining way was very popular. Others, such as these most eminent apostles, the Corinthian Christians loved to listen to. They were able to speak in this manner. Paul was either unable or unwilling to preach this way. If you think about the Apostle Paul and what we've studied before, he often did not present himself in any way that would lessen the message of Christ. And remember, Paul says, I could say that I was this and this and this. I was educated by this guy. I was raised in this way. I was tutored under this fellow. I was given these honors. But I'm not going there because they would detract from the message of Christ. See, Paul always put Jesus at the very center of everything that he did. And if being eloquent in speech was going to take away from who Jesus was and the message, Paul simply wasn't going to do it. It didn't matter to Paul because he wasn't concerned with meeting people's standards for polished, eloquent speech or entertaining speaking. He was concerned with faithfully preaching the gospel. Paul didn't have all the polish of a great speaker, but he knew God, and therefore he preached the gospel with power. And I think if there's any lesson for us, it's this, because I'm obviously not teaching pastors at this point. So many Christians, they lessen the thought of their impact because they say, well, I don't know all of the Bible. I can't quote all of the scriptures. I don't always know what to say. I don't have all of the answers. I'm not as good as so-and-so or so-and-so in sharing their testimony. There's not a lot I can do for the kingdom. And here's the reality of it. You don't have to memorize the whole Bible. You don't have to have all of the theological and doctrinal understanding of a pastor. You don't have to be wise in the eyes of men. The power of the gospel comes through the testimony of a changed life. What God did for you in that situation, how God has been faithful to you, how God's grace has changed you, how your outlook on life is different than it used to be, how Christ has brought you into a place of great joy and settledness and security and peace, things that the world doesn't have. That's your testimony. You don't have to be a brilliant theologian. Matter of fact, I would prefer that you not be. You don't have to be an eloquent speaker. I would prefer that you not be. Why? Because when we begin to exalt our own abilities, it takes away from the simplicity of the message of the gospel that Jesus Christ died, he was buried, and he was resurrected. He was the sufficient sacrifice once and for all time for the cleansing of the unrighteousness of man. That message is so simple, and sometimes we mess it up. And Paul is saying that he didn't want to take away from the gospel by being what other people expected him to be. He says, in every way we have made this evident to you in all things. Paul couldn't or wouldn't give the Corinthian Christians the polished and entertaining preaching that they wanted, but he did give them himself. Did I commit sin in humbling myself, the Apostle Paul writes, because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge? In the culture of the day, if a public speaker didn't take money for his speaking, he was often disregarded as a poor speaker with worthless teaching. Many people thought of someone who charged no speaking fee as strictly an amateur. But Paul didn't care about the opinions of others when it came to his heart for preaching the gospel without being accused of doing it for money. Paul's in a no-win situation here. Previously, the Corinthian Christians, the false teachers, had accused him of being a money monger, somebody who was only in it for the money, who was collecting money for his own personal gain and his own personal enrichment. Remember that whole discussion we had on him collecting money to take to the Jerusalem church that was under deep persecution, and there was famine and they were suffering. And of course, the Corinthian Christians accused Paul of being an embezzler and taking money and not really doing what he was supposed to do with it. So on the one hand, they were accusing him of taking money that he should not have taken. And then here they're accusing him of not taking money that he should have taken. This is that classic, in trouble if you do, in trouble if you don't. See, the Corinthian Christians were never going to be satisfied with Paul, at least not the false teachers. They roundly criticized him at every turn. So Paul says, did I commit a sin? This shows Paul at his most ironic. The Corinthian Christians who despised Paul were so worldly in their thinking that they actually thought that Paul might be in sin because he preached the gospel free of charge. How crazy is that? Paul says in an answer, he's like, you say I'm sinning because I'm not charging you for the gospel? He says, I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. And he didn't legitimately rob other churches. What he's saying is other churches were supporting me because you wouldn't support me. And now you're going to tell me that because you wouldn't support me, I was in sin? That's crazy. If that's your philosophy, if that's your way of thinking, then I was robbing the other churches that were paying me to take care of you. The word Paul used for robbed is strong here. It's classical Greek, and it's the word that was used for stripping a dead soldier of his armor. Paul refers to the fact that he received support from Christians in other cities during his time in Corinth. He could say that he robbed those other churches in the sense that by right, the Corinthian Christians should have supported him when he ministered to their spiritual needs. And instead, Paul was a burden to no one among the Corinthian Christians. He says, for what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. The other churches that Paul robbed were in the region of Macedonia, including the Philippian church. And Paul thanks them immensely for their generosity in his letter to them in Philippians chapter 4, verses 14 to 18. And we've got about 2.5 or 3 minutes left here, so I'm going to go a little bit farther today. And we're going to look at verse 10. It says, as the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the region of Achaia. Why? Because I do not love you? God knows that I do. But what I am doing, I will continue to do. And I may cut off opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the matter about which they are boasting. And he's talking again about the false apostles. And we're going to finish with 13 to 15 here. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as the apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore, it is not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their deeds. In other words, it's unbelievers who look like believers. And I think we'll kind of end with this warning. Every church throughout the ages, every church age, every church season, every church denomination, every church that has ever existed has had people on the inside who did not belong truly to the Lord. False teachers are at every turn, and they're not always taking the scriptures and they're, ripping the pages out and rewriting them in their own way. Many times false teachers are just those who just sow that seed of discontent. They have their own agenda. They don't like the person who's in charge for some reason. They think that they should maybe be the ones in charge. Maybe they want the honor. Maybe they want the prestige. Maybe they want the recognition or the money that goes with the position. The motives are as many as there are people. The role of the church is to always be wary and on guard, to protect the people from the false teachers, the deceitful workers, those who would seek to undermine the work of the Lord. And Paul says, look, one of the ways that you can tell who they are, they don't walk in humility. They're always trying to criticize. They're always finding fault. They're always spreading gossip. They're always stirring up trouble. The true apostle is a shepherd. He loves the sheep. He cares for the sheep. He encourages the sheep. He does away with strife. He solves problems. He doesn't create them. He loves people in spite of their weaknesses. He doesn't judge and measure people by outward appearance, but he sees them as Jesus sees them. A true shepherd preaches the gospel that Jesus is at the center of. They exalt Jesus above all things. False teachers exalt themselves above all things. And so when we think of the modern church and we look around and you say, well, how do you tell a false teacher from a real teacher? Well, one of the ways that you can is, who are they exalting? Who are they glorifying? Is their focus on making themselves look great, enriching themselves, being popular, or are they glorifying God? Is he the center? Do they walk in humility and allow Christ to be the center of all that they do? All right. God bless you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I love you. As always, if there's anything you need, please feel free to reach out to me.